Allison is the founder and CEO of Multilingual Education Reform Collective of Indianapolis or Mercy. She also is a wife, and she also is a mother of a little girl who's 7 years old. So she has a big hat and more than one hat that she wears every day. So I want to welcome her, and please, I do want to ask if you have any questions, please put them on the chat. I will keep track of that. And if there are any questions that I feel like they need to be answered at the moment as she's presenting, I will make sure she gets that. And otherwise, we'll wait for the questions towards the end of the presentation. Thank you. I will pass it on to you, Allison. Take the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Guadalupe. I appreciate it. I appreciate everyone's patience this morning. There's always something that goes awry in the tech world. So I'm glad that you are all here. I have some objectives of the presentation I wanted to share with you just briefly. And hopefully we'll be able to at least touch on a little bit of each of these with the time that we have this morning, reflecting on our classroom practices and interrogating our own language identities, and reflecting on any past language-related trauma. And in doing all that, hopefully we'll be able to work towards liberation and liberating ourselves and the language that we center in our classrooms. So the agenda this morning is here, and I want to share with you really first and foremost that this session that I planned today really came from my heart, and I'm still working on my journey to personal linguistic liberation. And that's why I really titled this presentation as Working Towards, because liberatory classrooms begin with ourselves and our self-liberation. And it is a long process, and it begins with interrogation and unlearning, and finally healing. And I'm myself somewhere between unlearning and healing, and preparing for this presentation in itself and being involved in this LEC community has really felt like part of that healing process for me, and has felt very cathartic. So to begin, a little bit about me and where I am from. It's important that we, and I'm sure we all do this in our classrooms, that we recognize and share personal identity, and we honor the people and places that we came from. And that's an integral part of our journey towards liberatory classrooms. And we all come from, not just one place, many different places, places and spaces and that have impacted our lives. So just a few about me. In the top left is Wonder Lake, Illinois, and that's where I spent the majority of my growing up years as a child. It was a small community in northern Illinois by the Wisconsin border. And underneath that is a picture of the St. Joseph's College Chapel, where I did my undergraduate degree. That was another home for me for 4 years. And after I graduated, I found myself in East Chicago, Indiana, teaching and working with the community there for about a decade. Originally, my family, my dad is from Puerto Rico. He was born in Ponce. I consider myself to be, a very multicultural person. My mom is a Euro-American. She's mostly Polish, but has a lot of other ethnicities also that she represents. And underneath the flag there is my daughter. As Guadalupe mentioned, I have a daughter. Her name is Cecilia. She's 7 years old. And now I work at Marian University. I am a teacher of future teachers, is what I like to say. It's a job that I really treasure, being able to have an influence on our next generation of teachers. And I had started a company over the summer, the Multilingual Education Reform Collective of Indianapolis. And this is reflective of now my new home that has been my home for 6 years, Indianapolis, and me wanting to really give back to the community here, specifically multilingual language learning programs in schools here in Indianapolis. And then finally, IUPUI School of Education is where I attend now for my PhD. So just a little bit about me. It's important that we know where we're coming from, so we know where we're going, right? So I'd love to know a little bit about all of you. If we could put in the chat some of the spaces, places, and people that you are from, I would love to see that. So, ¿de dónde son ustedes? If you could take a second and type in the chat where you all are from. And I don't know if I'm able to see, am I able to see? Oh yeah, I can see the chat. Or can I not see the chat, Alyssa?
You should be able to. People are saying they're from Mexico, Kansas City.
Oh, I see it now.
Yeah.
I can see it now.
Texas, California.
Awesome. Thank you. Great. Okay, I appreciate that. Okay. Digging in here, the first thing I want to discuss is the definition of linguicism. And here, the definition from Skutneb Kangas is linguicism is the ideology, structures, and practices which are used to legitimate, effectuate, regulate, and reproduce an unequal division of power and resources between groups, which are defined on the basis of language. So according to this definition, there are really three ways that discrimination, linguistic discrimination, permeates through our culture. And the first is ideologies, which are our belief systems. And the second is via structures, which can be described as overarching and longstanding systems, policies, and institutions. But the most visible daily examples of linguicism are found in our practices. And that's how we really enact our ideologies and through the practices within the parameters of the system in which we work. So in this case, for us, this is the educational system. So really simplified discrimination based on the basis of language and thinking about what language is spoken and why, and the spaces that we're in, what isn't spoken and why, and how it's spoken and why are things that we need to think about. So just unpacking that a little bit further and how these three things really impact each other. Ideologies, again, beliefs, biases, and these are all based on our social cultural conditioning. And we do have a deep and dark history of deficit ideology surrounding language in our country. This is just one of the examples that we've seen through our history, signs like this, "Welcome to America, now speak English," and the idea that English is what's right and what's best in all spaces. In his text, Dismantling Contemporary Deficit Thinking, Richard Valencia describes deficit ideology as endogenous. So that means that those who are different are internally deficient. So the education system here, as we can see, the system as the structures, this is school building, is set up to see these differences like linguistic difference as a deficit. And when we see deficit thinking in action, is really oppression. And those practices in our classrooms turn up looking like English only classrooms, honestly, rows instead of tables, minimal student interaction, and even things like multilingual learners being pulled from specials, to work on their English in a very rote way and missing out on those other enrichment opportunities. So we're going to do a reflection here. And I want to start with my own, right, as a model. We know as teachers, modeling is important. So we're going to dig in first to our ideologies around language, our relationships, our beliefs, and the values that we assign language. And I will say that my relationship with language is very complicated. My father came from Puerto Rico when he was a small child and was placed in a Catholic orphanage. And when he's asked, which is regularly, why he doesn't speak Spanish, he says, "The nuns beat it out of me." And this is why I wasn't raised speaking Spanish. So for me, the loss of my heritage language, and for my dad, the loss of our heritage language, is a great one. And it results in a linguistic chasm between our gente who speak Spanish and those who do not. And, you know, many of us might be aware of this contention within our community, as many parents are determined that the only way for their children to make it in this country is through this complete linguistic assimilation, to speak English only. And I think that we see that changing somewhat now, but not entirely. But I assign cultural value, a lot of cultural value, to language. To me, it's an enlace to my heritage and the island where my father was born and the people with whom I most identify. So because of this, my lack of Spanish fluency has been a source of pain and shame for me throughout my life. So that's my example of how I would reflect on my ideologies around language. We do have a short time and a lot to unpack, and we all have a story, as Sophia said this morning. So I would like everyone to share their voice around their ideologies here, but also make sure that we share the mic kind of equally. And if we have less than 10, we can stay together and just let people come off their mic, off mute, and share. But if we have more than 10, I'd like us to group into 2 small groups.
There's a total of 12, and I believe those 12 include us and the interpreter and Lisa, so I think we should be good. And they should be able to click on the unmute button and be able to share.
Okay, thank you. I'd love to hear from you all.
We have 7 people. So
Yeah.
Perfect, perfect.
And someone just type on the chat if they're not able to take the unmute button. It says, thank you for sharing. I had to decolonize my brand and find the beauty, power, history, culture of, and I don't know what that stands for. Please feel free to jump in and correct me, AAEB. Proudly encode, switching, and regularly preach that slang and isn't AAEB and has value.
Yes.
And even myself not knowing what that is. I don't know if you do.
African American Vernacular English.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. What other beliefs do we have about language? What relationships do we have?
I could share real quick if that's okay.
Please do.
So I actually have kind of a similar story where my dad, who was born in Mexico, his parents never spoke it around him. They purposely didn't let him or my tia grow up learning it. So I've been trying to learn Spanish on my own through school mostly since I was in 6th grade. And it's just been, I've just so wanted to be able to connect with my abuelo and the rest of my family who's still in Mexico. And it's just so much harder with that added barrier. And now I have the huge honor of being able to work at a bilingual school that actually focuses on having, we have a huge Latina population. And so we try to, have English and Spanish wherever as much as possible, and just being able to work there has improved my Spanish much faster than any classes have. So I'm kind of in this position of really wanting to learn a language and not having had good resources to do that, and just hoping to, learn more about my culture through it.
Thank you, Grace. I can empathize with that. Thank you. Go ahead, Erica.
Hi, thanks. So for me, it's a similar story. I did grow up with a Mexican mother. I have my baby here with me. Yeah, so I grew up with a Mexican mother and an American father. And so then there was this weird duality in the household where for my mother, it was a huge part of the culture that we learned the Spanish, and it was very important to her. But amongst cousins and friends and family, we were like, always a little too white and made fun of the Spanish we did speak, because it was my mom was very, very, very focused on academic Spanish being like, very proper in her language. So then we were too white with our Mexican family, and then we were too Mexican with our white family. So it's like that weird, you don't really fit in with either group issue.
Yeah. Gloria Ansaldúa calls it ni de aquí ni de allá.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
See, and I have a couple people that are typing on the chat. Allison, hi, I learned Spanish in high school and I was encouraged to keep learning in college, which I did, but I grew up in a community where community belief that was that people of other cultures coming to the USA should learn and speak only English. We have Paola, my language story, it's a little different. I was only allowed to speak Spanish at home and school was strictly English.
Yes, we all have these stories. We all have which has shaped our ideology around language. So thank you. I appreciate you sharing. I want to go next into the structures. So in image 1, we see actually this is the sign posted at my alma mater, St. Joseph's College in Rensselaer, Indiana. Was founded as an Indian normal school. And so as we know, indigenous tribes who lived and still live in the US long before it was colonized, they spoke and they still speak, but fight to maintain their own tribal languages. But after about 200 years of attempted erasure of indigenous peoples, many of those that remained were entered and forced into these Indian normal schools. And this was a goal, was for full assimilation into the at the time, the now dominant Western European culture. So this assimilation included a religious assimilation into Christianity, and in this case, the missionaries of the Precious Blood were Catholic, but and also linguistic, assimilation. And these same deficit-oriented perspectives carried forward into the 40s and 50s. An example of that can be found in the documentary Stolen Education, which tells the story of 8 Mexican-American students who were forced to remain in first grade for 3 years simply because they spoke Spanish. These students ended up testifying in federal court in a discrimination case called Hernandez versus Driscoll Independent Consolidated School District, and they actually won that case. But this type of linguistic segregation is not something that we typically hear or learn about in schools when we learn about segregation and desegregation. And we need to think about why that is. And we need to learn as much as we can and teach our students as much as we can about the contributions that our gente made to the desegregation movement, as well as the repercussions of segregation, desegregation, and contemporary resegregation of our schools. The impact that all of that has had on our lives, whether it's directly or indirectly through our families. And the last picture, number 3, this is the picture of the Catholic orphanage that my father was placed into in 1960. Again, my family on my dad's side came from Puerto Rico by way of Florida to Chicago in the early 60s. And he did not speak any English when he was placed in this institution. So he remembers being scared and hiding under the large wooden tables. And he wasn't allowed to speak Spanish. Again, the nuns beat it out of him, as he said. So these stories are unfortunately not uncommon, and their impacts, they reverberate throughout generations. So these are examples, just a few, unfortunately, examples of linguicism and linguistic trauma. Unfortunately, there are many that, continued generations or decades after that and generations after that, and many more unfortunately continue today. And, it's our job to break them down, essentially, to work towards breaking them down. So and the next reflection is on these structures, right? So how did our schooling, what were our schooling experiences related to language, and how has this system, this educational system, impacted your relationship with language. In my reflection, again, I grew up in an English speaking system, so I didn't have, there wasn't a bilingual school actually anywhere where I lived at the time. And so, the impact for me from the system was the trauma that my father experienced and how that reverberates throughout my life. So I see it as now I see it, I had to go through my own process of recognizing this and taking the blame and shame off myself for not speaking Spanish, and realizing now that this is a source of generational trauma and an oppression that happened to my family. In her text, Identifying Affirming Classrooms, Erica Buchanan Rivera says, if we can interrogate systems of power, we can begin to dream, dismantle, and heal forms of oppression. So I'd like to just have a short interrogation here and on these reflection questions. So again, if we could come off mute or put in the chat your responses to these questions. What did your schooling experiences teach you about language? What did they show you about language?
Feel free to put it on the chat as well, and I will read it. Paula, in California, I had bilingual instruction until 3rd grade. I remember the focus on speaking and writing in proper English has the default academic model of communication. Academic mode, okay.
Hi, everybody. So I grew up in South Texas, and while none of our education was formally in Spanish, every single one of my teachers spoke Spanish. So they communicated with us in Spanish at times. Like Spanglish is very much a thing here, where both languages are just used interchangeably. So my experience with language in when I was in school was that it was, our mother tongue was welcome in the classroom, though it was never used academically, I guess, if that makes sense. So yeah.
Thank you, Anissa. I hope I pronounced your name right, but thank you for sharing that. And that's important what you said about while it was welcome, it wasn't the language of the academics. So that will come up a little bit later. Thank you for sharing that.
I also have Erica says, in my Spanish immersion elementary schools, there was a very colonial attitude towards academic Spanish only. From middle school forward, the same colonial approach to language existed, but now in anyone speaking proper English.
That's also an important point, the distinctions between what is considered proper and what isn't in both English and in Spanish.
And even if it's just the accent, I have faced myself in different parts of the United States. The words or the way that they pronounced it's different.
Thank you. So this leads us to the process of unlearning then. We learn from our families and we learn from our school, the schooling experiences. And we might have even, think about other systems and structures, places of work that maybe we encountered certain values and policies related to linguistic discrimination. But many of the students that I was talking about from stolen education are now senior citizens, and they never really spoke out about what happened to them. It's, again, Stolen Education is a documentary. If you haven't seen it, I think that is worth watching. I think that was one of the things that stood out to me, was that they just never said anything about it to their families. They never really talked about it afterwards in the community, but yet they did feel the impact of being held back those 3 years, and they felt that for decades. And I think that for those of us, who are from Latinx backgrounds, we all have some version of the, I'm Puerto Rican, remember, so we have some version of the pa'lante mentality. We keep going, we don't look back, because we have to move forward quickly to survive. And I think the impact of that is we don't stop to assess the damage and ask ourselves these pertinent questions about what has impacted us and why, and to truly begin the process of healing. And so we have to first start with the unlearning of the bias that we might carry towards ourselves because of the impacts of the systems that we went through. And the bias that we may then carry to our students, our other teachers. And this was mentioned, thinking about what constitutes a language. What do we consider a language? Do we consider dialect a language? Somebody mentioned that about, do we consider vernacular a language? Somebody mentioned African American vernacular English. Do we welcome and accept these different forms of English, of Spanish, in our classrooms, in our lives? And why, if not, why, if we do we do it in an academic sense, as I think Anissa brought up? So what might we need to, if we could put in the chat, what do you think we need to unlearn in order to work towards linguistic liberation in our classrooms? What might you need to unlearn or unpack more about your experiences and what happens in your classroom? And what language, dialect, and dialects are you centering, and why? So the question is unlearning. What do we need to unlearn? What have we already unlearned? What are we in the process of unlearning?
If I may speak, for me personally, what I'm going through right now is I'm trying to unlearn any shame that I feel around how unperfect my Spanish is. So I mentioned earlier that because of where I grew up, it's South Texas. You go to stores and there's a lot of things in Spanish and in English, and we kind of have created our own language down here. And now that I live in Missouri, where different dialect different dialects of Spanish are spoken, sometimes some of the students that I teach like to try to, it's with love, but try to bully me a little bit in because of the way that I speak Spanish. So I'm trying to unlearn any of the shame that I feel around how unperfect my Spanish is.
Thank you for sharing that. And good for you for recognizing that and going through that process, because it's hard. Do we have other examples in the chat?
We do. I have Dr. B. I'm learning the sheer anti-blackness.
Mm,
That's just powerful. That's connected to the language. I taught my students about language and cultural diffusion and ethnocentrist.
thank you. We do see anti-Blackness as a worldwide issue and something that is very present within our own Latinx community. And yeah, we definitely see the impact of that and what we allow, how we allow students to speak in our classrooms.
Yes, so we have Diane. Thank you for this session. The answers to these questions are complex, and I apologize for taking a while to respond. I was discouraged to speak the language at home and encouraged to speak the language at school, English, so that I could speak a better English than my relatives. That's just powerful.
Thank you for sharing that. It is a lot. It is a lot to process. I agree. In a short amount of time, but thank you.
And this one's powerful too. Paola, to learn that English is the master language.
Mm,
And we know it's not.
thank you. Yeah, we have no official language of the United States. There are unfortunately many movements still to have English be our official language, and there are many states that have adopted it in the state as their official language, but it is not nationwide. And even if it was, we would have to interrogate that and think about who made that determination and why. So we move to healing as the next step, and how to tame a wild tongue. Gloria Ansaldúa writes, ethnic identity is twin skin to linguistic identity. I am my language. Until I can take pride in my language, I cannot take pride in myself. In her book, she also describes our in-group oppression. One of you mentioned that about other Spanish speakers critiquing your Spanish. We have in-group oppression, just like we have anti-Blackness within our group. She mentions trying to quote out Chicano each other. Who is a real Latinx person? Who speaks the best Spanish, or even who speaks the best English? Who is Latinx enough? Who is American enough? Which really translates to white enough. So what is enough to make you enough? I would like you to consider that question. And if it's not pertinent to you, to your students, what is enough to make you enough? What is enough to make them enough? And Julian for Spider-Man, Julian Randall states, there are as many ways to be Latinx as there are Latinx people. There is not one way to be. So this work, the unlearning and the healing, it does require emotional vulnerability. And that vulnerability supports the co-construction of the classroom as a liberatory and transformational space. So we say we have to have a brave space, not a safe space, because we have to be brave enough to be vulnerable, and we have to be courageous enough to open and share space with our students like this, and how I am sharing this space and sharing my vulnerability with all of you, and you are sharing it back with me today. And we have to practice radical acceptance of who we are and what language we speak and how we speak it. So that moves us to our practices, and there's 4 main practices I want to highlight here. So because we enact our practices based on our ideologies. So our ideologies have been all shaped by all of our experiences to this point, which we've talked about. And we've talked about how language is synonymous with identity. So the first one I want to talk about is honor. In the text, Anti-Racism and Universal Design for Learning, Andra Tisha Fitzgerald states that anti-racism and universal design for learning really begin with honor. And we can do this first by understanding and considering our own power over our classroom practice. And some of us may have a lot more than other based on the context where we teach, but we are still the teacher. That gives us power in that space. So we have that power, but we have to be courageous enough to share that power with our students and allow them to co-construct learning experiences, allow them to engage in classroom decision-making. The students have to be greater and more important than the systems that we are under, and we have to put the students ahead of our personal preferences, and we have to put the students ahead and over the curriculum and the standards sometimes, which all of that is difficult, and it especially depending on where we work. So honoring our students first and foremost by sharing the stage with them. Secondly, the space, creating the space for students to think about and be their true authentic selves. So that begins with us knowing and accepting ourselves well enough for us to show up in that space as our true authentic selves, not hiding anything, not ashamed of anything, of who we are, where we came from. And again, Erica Buchanan Rivera says, as educators, we have the power to cultivate spaces that teach students to see who they are and who they are not. Thirdly, connection. We must foster a deep sense of connection with and among the students in our classrooms, forming that community that feels like familia. And we can do this by sharing our stories openly and weaving them together with our student stories to form a collective history. As humans, we do crave this connection, and we need it not only to survive, but to thrive in our environments. We are braver and more powerful together, and we are able to use that collective power to challenge these systems and structures of the status quo that we are under. Through community, we learn about justice and power, says Erica Buchanan Rivera. Finally, intention. We place intention behind our prayers. We place intentions behind our meditations if we are spiritual people. But we have to place that same type of intention behind our pedagogical practices and center our students in that intention. And I can say honestly, and I am guilty of not always creating learning experiences intentionally. So that's something that I continue to work towards. We have to intentionally create the space, intentionally plan this time for connection, intentionally honor the students by building instruction from their assets and their funds of knowledge. There are 3 specific practices that I believe meet these 4 overarching themes. One would be called cogenerative dialogue. And that I read about first from Chris Emden in his book, For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood, and the rest of y'all too. Cogenerative dialogues are bringing small groups of your students together during non-instructional time, really for them to have voice and feedback over your classroom instruction, how it's going and where it's going next, allowing them that brave space to tell you how they really feel and how the instruction is really going for them and what other ideas they have for where it can go next. Cogenerative dialogue. Second, community circle. Many of us do community circle in our classroom, and I believe it never runs its course no matter how old our students are. I do community circle with my college students who are studying to be teachers. Community circle. Just simply coming together, breathing together, as Sophia had us breathe this morning, and asking them, how are you today? What stories do you have to share? What's going on with you? Just being in community with each other and taking time to center humanity in our classrooms over standards, over curriculum. And the third one being translanguaging, which many of us might be familiar with, just allowing students to pull from their entire linguistic repertoire, whether that be different different languages, Spanish, English, different dialects of the languages, different vernaculars of the language, allowing them, that's part of being their true authentic selves. However it comes out of our mouth sometimes is how it's meant to come out. And so honoring that with our students, allowing them to feel comfortable, even if it's in an academic, supposed to be in an academic way. We can talk about academics using what's not traditionally considered academic language. And I'd love to hear other ideas. I'm sure, sharing ideas is so powerful as well in the chat of how we can have these liberatory practices in our classrooms. Other ideas in the chat. So we'll put those ideas in the chat, and I'm going to keep going here for time's sake, moving towards liberation. So liberation, requires transformational resistance. So as I said, using whatever language comes naturally for you in each moment, using it and feeling good about that is resistance. So it's continually practicing that and continually pushing against the system. So resist. I have some questions questions I want you to kind of carry with you as you're working towards this linguistic liberation in your classroom. The first one is, whose knowledge and therefore language am I privileging in my class and why? Whose knowledge and therefore language am I privileging in my class and why? What do we consider academic language? Whose knowledge is most important? Secondly, what message am I sending to students with the pedagogical choices I'm making? What message am I sending to my students with the pedagogical choices I'm making? What message am I sending to myself with the pedagogical choices I'm making? Where do my ideologies stem from? Where do my ideologies stem from? And a follow up to that, why am I doing it this way? In your classroom, simple things, even like transitions between activities. Why am I doing it this way? Why does it need to be done this way? Says who? Says who? And lastly, how am I enacting my ideologies in practice? How am I providing a space for students to express their individuality and authenticity? Asks Erica Buchanan Rivera. And finally, I ask to you, how are you honoring your students and their whole selves? How are you honoring your students? So I will end, and then hopefully we'll have time for catching up in the chat and questions and just a little bit of discussion here. I will end with these quotes from this book I just finished like last week. You Sound Like a White Girl by Julissa Arce. We have to create new spaces, new systems, and new rules that are based on truth and justice for all. Our solutions are in us, and we must accept our power. Thank you all